The lecture hall smelled of old paper and cheap coffee, a scent that seemed to hang permanently under the fluorescent lights of Whitfield Hall. A hush moved through the seats like a tide as Dr. Victor Langley fixed the room with the kind of gaze that reduced people to data points. Names on a roster, faces in a dataset, mistakes waiting to be made. 200 students felt it, an electropressure that focused like a lens on the small figure seated 3 rows from the front. She sat with a blue notebook on her lap, fingers tucked around the spine, eyes level and still. Her name on the roster read, Amara Reid. Her hair was braided close to her scalp. Her skin caught the light like onyx. To the room, she was quiet. To Langley, she was a curiosity and, crucially, an opening. Perhaps you should consider a less demanding subject, Miss Reid, Langley said, voice crisp as the lecture slides behind him. Not everyone has the frame of mind to understand advanced biochemistry. There was a rustle, a nervous breeze of laughter from a few corners, the soft scrape of a pen as someone stopped writing to watch. The silence that followed Langley's jab became a weight, a physical thing pressing against Amara's shoulders. She felt her neck heat up, not from shame, but from that familiar calibration, that moment when someone tried to define her by a single syllable, a single stereotype. She had grown used to the tilt of eyes when she walked into rooms like this. Pity, suspicion, the polite assumption that she was a scholarship number, not a scholar. At 22, the daughter of a cleaner and a bus driver, Amara had navigated 1,000 small humiliations to make it this far. Her scholarship was the narrow bridge between 2 worlds. She had learned to walk it measured and unremarked. Langley adjusted his glasses with a theatrical flick. "Answer the question, Miss Reid," he said. "Or would you prefer to admit that you're out of your depth?" He wanted performance. He wanted a crack. He wanted, in his own quiet way, to teach with the cruelty of someone who measures authority in the number of broken students he can name. A dozen heads turned. The classroom air hummed. Amara closed her notebook and breathed in slowly. The world, as it often did, narrowed into a grid of facts and reasoning that settled like tiles under her feet. CRISPR, Cas9, she began. It acts like molecular scissors through a 2-step mechanism. First, it recognizes a target sequence using a complementary guide, RNA. Then Cas9 induces a double-strand break at the target site, allowing for DNA repair pathways to introduce edits. Langley's brow pinched. Elementary, Miss Reid. Any first-year student would know that. Now explain the ethical implications of the study by Wong et al. On gene editing in human embryos. Nature Biotechnology, Volume 87, page 834. It wasn't in the syllabus. I mentioned it in passing. Consider it a test of your depth. He smiled, slow and predatory. It was the smile of a man who had built a career in finding traps and making them look like lessons. The class watched, divided between a low curiosity and a desire for spectacle. Amara felt the weight again, not from him, but from the idea that she was being presented as an exhibit. She could have declined. She could have faltered. That would have been the easy archetype they expected. She answered. The study by Wong and colleagues. Nature Biotechnology, Volume 87, pages 834 to 841, presents 3 principal ethical concerns, she said, voice steady. First, informed consent. Embryos cannot consent to permanent genomic changes that affect subsequent generations. Second, inequality of access. If such interventions are commercialized without equitable distribution, genetic enhancement may become a new axis of socioeconomic stratification. Third, precedent setting for non-therapeutic modifications, which Wong explicitly notes on page 837 could lead to unforeseen shifts in human evolution. Langley's frown deepened. Correct, he conceded dryly, although I doubt you understood the subtler nuances. Amara raised her chin. The article's conclusion argues for a balance between innovation and precaution established through inclusive global dialogue. Wong cites complementary studies by Garcia and Patel that argue delaying gene therapies can have an ethical cost in lost lives. The trade-off is non-trivial. It rippled across the hall, a collective intake of breath. Langley's skin went a pallid shade. "You seem to have memorized a few articles," he said with a cold smile. "A useful skill, but no substitute for true understanding. Let's test your critical thinking." He tossed a hypothetical. A remote community with a rare genetic disease. The only potential cure involved experimentation on their children. The community lacked resources to fully weigh risks. Would the researcher implement the treatment? Justify using Harrington's model of scientific responsibility? Langley's intention was obvious. Trap her with complexity, spotlight her, and then savor the humiliation when she failed under pressure. Amara's voice did not tremble. The scenario is a false dichotomy. Harrington, 2019, explicitly frames such dilemmas as a spectrum. An ethically informed approach would be three-tiered. First, education and capacity building within the community. Second, establishment of a community council with genuine decision-making power. Third, phased implementation with systematic monitoring and the right to withdraw. Harrington even warns, page 47, that assuming vulnerability equals incapacity is itself the greatest ethical error. She quoted the line, crisp and true. A murmur ran through the room. Some students' fingers paused mid-keystroke. Others shifted in their seats to see the shape of the exchange. Dr. Eliza Chun, a professor of medical ethics and an invited observer, watched with a slow, intrigued furrow in her brow. Langley slammed his palm on the lectern. "This isn't a book club," he barked. "This is serious science. Precisely why we must recognize the accepted methodology for these dilemmas," Amara replied. "Which is why." "Miss Reid, you stay," Langley cut in when the class broke up. "We need to discuss your performance." Outside the door, the afternoon had already decided to slide toward evening. Amara's phone buzzed. Zoe, curly-haired and quick, threw her a text. "Café Artois? Now, we need to talk." Amara's brain, precise, almost surgical, had already cataloged the exchange, each word stored as though she were building a dossier. Langley had shown his letters. Arrogance, condescension, thinly veiled menace. He hadn't meant to hand her power. He had meant to shame. But in the way of small, inevitable ironies, he had given her evidence. At Café Artois, a group gathered like a small conspiracy. Zoe was there, cheeks flushed with indignation. Ryan, quiet, produced a disguised audio recorder from a messenger bag. Dr. Chun, who had lingered after class, offered discreet guidance. "He crossed the line," she said, soft and direct. "If you choose to pursue this, document everything." Amara had known all along that taking on a professor like Langley was not about winning a single lecture. It was about tilting an entire system that had taught him to believe he could define who belonged where. Her mind, a razor honed by necessity and practice, cataloged more than facts. She remembered inflections, the way Langley softened the final consonant when he thought he was being clever, the small, contemptuous laugh he let out when a question was inconvenient. She had read his columna, dissected his survey questions, scanned his acknowledgments and grant disclosures. She assembled contradictions, instances where the public principle diverged from private grants, where ethical posturing had lined up with corporate funding. When Ryan held up the recorder, Amara did not blink. She had done the math. The probability that a dean would take action increased with corroboration. Proof mattered more than peak. The trap they set was not spontaneous. Amara compiled a folder. Minutes from departmental meetings, email threads where Langley subtly undermined scholarship applications, excerpts from his own op-eds that contradicted his lectures, testimonials from former students. She flagged the most relevant passages and indexed them. Then she sent it, with a calm cover letter, to the Ethics Committee and to Dean Blackwell. She wrote nothing of vengeance. Her language was clinical, precise, insisting on accountability. The week that followed was a lesson in how slowly and how suddenly institutions could move. Langley insisted he had been misquoted, misunderstood. Students whispered that he had tenure. Professors murmured about precedent. Yet public discomfort is a pressure that finds seams. An op-ed in the campus paper, and signed it first, then traced to Zoe's editorial team, ran with the headline, "Patterns of Bias, a Quiet Culture of Diminishment." It was careful, linking anecdote to pattern. It mentioned a phrase students had become familiar with: the right kind of mind. Once a phrase takes wing, people begin to remember their own small bruises. When Langley announced an open masterclass in the amphitheater, the news spread like a flare. He loved large audiences, a chance for performance, for authority. He would, he thought, convert spectacle into absolution. What he did not expect was that Amara would prepare a spectacle of her own. She spent the week like a glassblower at a furnace. Memory is a strange instrument. For some it is a trick, for others a compass. Amara's brain was both vault and engine. She read everything Langley had published in the last 15 years. Journal articles, op-eds, grant acknowledgments, letters written to journals, mentor statements. She transcribed, cross-referenced, and prepared a dossier of contradictions. Carefully cited, annotated again. She found where Langley had urged expedience in the name of saving lives, and where he had advised delay when a sponsor's interests were in question. She found patterns of review comments that slid from clinical to dismissive when the subject's name signaled a minority identity. The evidence was not one smoking gun. It was a filament net. On the night of the masterclass, the amphitheater filled with the usual crowd and more. The faculty sat on the stage like judges. The lights made them small and monumental at once. Langley took the podium and began, his voice smooth, presenting the Hammond-Langley principle of ethical proportionality, a phrase he had coined and polished for decades. The irony of the self-naming did not escape the room. Amara sat in the front row, hands folded, the folder on her lap warm with possibility. Dr. Chin sat 2 seats to her right, the dean in the back rows, deliberately distant. The university's ethics committee members had been given copies of her dossier 3 days earlier. The recording Ryan had made of the private exchange in the office. Langley's threats about making sure problem students find their true level. It was cued, a small button away from public air. "Professor Langley," Amara said, raising her hand. The quiet that followed was an animal hush. He blinked, then called her name. "Yes, Miss Reid." "Professor," she said, cool and precise. "You recently published Ethical Frontiers in Genetic Research in the Journal of Bioethics, 2018. Page 142, paragraph 3, you argued that cultural and socioeconomic considerations should be secondary to scientific advancement. How does that align with the proportionality principle you're presenting tonight?" A breath moved through the auditorium. Langley's mouth made a small shape. He had not expected this. Not from her, not now. "I don't know what you mean," he lied. "I can quote the paragraph," Amara said. She did then precisely what she had rehearsed 1,000 times. She recited, verbatim, the passage from his paper, then cross-referenced it with his speech. The evidence landed like cold bricks. The murmurs morphed into an audible shuffling. She produced a folder and handed it to the dean in the back. She was not theatrical. She was clear and methodical. "I have also compiled instances across your publications where your conclusions shift with funding sources," she added. "I have emails where students from minority backgrounds were subtly dismissed. And I have a recording of a private threat you made in my presence." Langley's face went from flushed to ashen. The auditorium seemed to hold its breath in a way that made the lights buzz. He pounded the pulpit. "This is not the time. The time was any moment you chose to cross the line," Amara said. "If you believe in the principle you preach, then you should welcome scrutiny." From the back, a door opened. Dean Blackwell, and members of the ethics committee walked forward with the deliberation of people who had been handed responsibility. Langley tried to regain control. Bluster, anger, half-coherent accusations of misinterpretation. He called for process. He accused her of entrapment. Ryan produced the recording. Zoe produced a printed testimony she had collected through anonymous outreach. Students stood and whispered names of old grievances. The room folded in on itself. The first turning point of Amara's fight was not legal but moral, when the university stood and listened. The dean did what institutions sometimes do in crisis: convene, investigate, promise transparency. Langley was suspended pending review. For the first time, a man who had relied on cultural capital to bully lesser-known minds was removed from the stage he had dominated. When the dean spoke to Amara later, he was formally apologetic. He offered scholarships, an invitation to doctoral placement, a position within the research group of Dr. Chun. Amara accepted none and accepted all, in the manner of someone measuring allyship and choosing a path. But the second turning point came from the past. Dozens of former students filed complaints. Papers were re-examined. The review committee found patterns. More than one life had been rerouted by a voice emptied of empathy. The university published a statement that felt both monumental and fragile. Langley's file, once enviable, contained notes about biased assessments. Offers were rescinded from visiting professorships. There were whispers about lawsuits. The man who had always believed his name alone conferred truth found his authority eroded. The university began a new blind review protocol for grading, an administrative gesture that spoke to a slow desire to correct systemic bias. Still, victory did not come without cost. The third turning point revealed itself when the backlash arrived, not only from Langley's defenders, but from a cultural machinery that equates accusation with career-ending social media. Beyond the campus, op-eds appeared accusing Amara of weaponizing memory against an elderly scholar. A radio host equated the affair to a persecution. Langley took legal counsel. He threatened defamation suits. The narrative splintered. The public could not settle on a single truth. Amara felt the pressure of 1,000 eyes, some compassionate, others hungry for spectacle. She had hoped the evidence would be enough. It was not ever that simple. The fight moved into hearings and testimonies. Langley's defenders argued that context matters, that words could be read differently when lifted from an era or a paragraph. He framed his critics as ideologues. The university's review committee had to contend with nuance as though it were a river of contradictions that could overflow at any moment. Amara testified. She played the recording. She spoke about the pattern of microaggressions, the small dismissals that had accumulated into a culture of exclusion. Her testimony was not melodrama. It was a ledger. She knew that guilt is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a file that, when opened, reveals the same small stains repeated. The hearings were grueling. Langley supporters painted Amara as opportunistic. Some former students who had once suffered in silence resurfaced to support her. Dr. Chin's reputation as an ethicist gave weight to the complaints. The dean, visibly strained, sought a path that would hold the university's claim to fairness without reducing the process to a public lynching. It was a tightrope. In the end, the committee's verdict favored Amara. Langley was removed from his role, banned from mentorship privileges, and the university pledged an external audit of grading practices across departments. For many, it was a moral earthquake. For others, it was a beginning. The climax, the intense moment that turned the event from a set of administrative actions into the kind of moral story that travels far, happened at a national bioethics conference 3 months later. Amara was invited to speak about systemic bias in medical research. She prepared a talk that was part scholarship, part testimony. The conference hall hummed with authority: professors, journalists, industry funders, students. She felt, briefly, the old familiar pressure, belonging and not belonging braided together. After her presentation, someone approached her, a man with a name tag that read Victor Langley. His hair was thinner. His face looked drawn. He had the air of a person who has practiced dignity until it becomes performance. "You ruined my career," he said quietly. Amara looked at him. She could have said so many things. A list of harms, legal counterpoints, the moral anatomy of a career built on unexamined power. Instead, she chose something simpler. "No," she said. "You ruined your own career the moment you decided that some students deserved less based on appearance. Your words defined you." Langley opened his mouth, closed it, and walked away. The simplicity of rejection can be devastating. It is the final punctuation on a sentence of accountability. Amara felt a tightness in her chest, but it was not triumphal. It was complicated. There was sorrow for what others had lost under his hand, relief that she could now name a system and hope for change, and a weary recognition that structural rot is stubborn. The denouement took on a softer texture. The university implemented blind grading for core classes, an external review of past evaluations, and a committee, in part student-led, to monitor bias complaints. Amara accepted a fellowship with Dr. Chin not as a consolation, but as a choice, to be present where ethics met practice. She began mentoring undergraduates who reminded her of her younger self. Brilliant and diffident, tentative in a world that presumed they would prove themselves. She walked campus corridors differently, no longer invisible, but not seeking the limelight. She had learned how to balance memory and mercy. There were quieter endings. Former students wrote to her, thanking her for giving them language and courage. Some stories were small. A woman who had been told she lacked the temperament for research now had a postdoc interview. A Latino student who had been advised to find a practical field decided to apply to medical school. These things, ephemeral and cumulative, felt like a slow, spreading light. Amara's memory remained her strange, beautiful burden. She remembered details some would find microscopic. The exact phrasing of an email that implied inferiority, the casual laugh that accompanied a patronizing pivot. But she also remembered things that kept her anchored, smiles given by professors who had believed in her, the steady presence of her mother, who came in the margins of weekends to wash the dorm sheets that sustained her scholarships. Her genius, for all its capacity, had never been merely about recall. It had always been also about loyalty to truth, to other people, to the idea that a single voice placed carefully could shift the invisible weights of an institution. The final scene of the affair was not a public triumph, but a small, tender moment. Amara walked into the campus garden in late autumn and found Zoe and Ryan waiting with coffee. They sat on a bench beneath a maple tree, the leaves like embers falling around them. Zoe, who had been loud and fierce through the whole affair, held Amara's hands and said, "You did it. You changed things." Amara squeezed back and let herself be small and human for a second. "It's not over," she said. "It will never be over. Systems don't fix themselves overnight. That's why we have you," Zoe said with the unswerving conviction of an ally who had seen the world and chosen a side. Amara laughed softly. The sound there was not triumph, but an exhale. "You don't need me," she said. "You need courage." She let the words settle. Memory had its pride, but courage had its own ballast. Months later, when she reviewed her dossier in the quiet of her apartment, she noticed something else. Lines of testimony that had been beneath the spotlight. Students who had once endured quietly were now writing to ask how to build cases, how to document patterns. Amara began hosting small workshops, not on tactics alone, but on languages of truth. How to record, how to keep evidence without turning life into litigation, how to sustain oneself through the moral labor of accountability. She became a fulcrum, not because she sought power, but because she had learned to wield a tool she had been given. The world did not simplify into binaries. Langley's departure did not cleanse the university of bias overnight. There were new missteps, new blind spots, and long corridors where the old habits retreated only to resurface in subtle ways. But the culture shifted in measurable folds. More students of color were nominated for research awards. The hiring committee included voices it had once excluded, and the dean's office no longer treated concerns as embarrassments to be smoothed. At the very end, when asked about what had driven her, Amara's answer was small and fierce. "I remember," she said, "because forgetting would be a kind of betrayal. But remembering is not enough. You need to act. Memory without courage is just information. Courage without knowledge is just impulse. You need both." That sentence traveled. It was quoted in an editorial, printed on a poster in the student union, repeated in a speech at the commencement ceremony. It found, small and stubborn, its way into the world. Years later, at a university reunion, former students, some with gray at their temples, spoke not only of careers but of the difference the moment had made to their sense of dignity. They told stories of professors who adjusted their pedagogy, of committees that now required blind grading. They smiled at Amara not because she had toppled a man, but because she had helped them name the thing that had kept their dreams small. Amara stood in a corner with her notebook under her arm, listening. She had become, reluctantly, a symbol, and she accepted it with caution. There was a small, private victory that she treasured. The knowledge that where there had been a culture of quiet diminishment, students now spoke, sometimes haltingly, sometimes loudly, of fairness and of truth. One afternoon, years later, a young woman approached her in the library. "Miss Reid," she asked, voice small, "I don't know if you remember me. I was in Professor Langley's class a few years back. You changed everything." Amara smiled, the kind that arrived steady and warm. "I remember," she replied. "That's the point." The young woman laughed, then began to cry. "I needed to hear that," she said. "I needed to know someone saw us." Amara reached out and squeezed her hand. She had, over time, learned what power memory could do when met with compassion. She had learned that the most consequential acts are not always loud but precise. A recording in a pocket, a folder on a dean's desk, a speech that names the truth. She had learned that the system could be shifted, imperfectly but irrevocably, by people who refused to be small. In the wake of the the Langley affair, names changed in the press as suits and legality spiraled. The campus hosted a memorial for better practices, new training, new committees, new channels. It was, in its way, anonymous progress. It was messy. It was necessary. Amara's final thought in the telling of the story was not about vengeance. It was about a candle lit in a dark room, small, fierce, and enough to show the way. Her memory would keep a ledger of every slight, every kindness, every inconsistency. But more than that ledger, she carried a different store, the quiet conviction that truth, when spoken precisely and with courage, has a gravity that can shift entire institutions. As autumn turned to winter and the campus lights took on that tender glow of study lamps and late classes, students passed through Whitfield Hall with new phrases in their mouths: evidence, accountability, dignity. Amara walked among them with a deliberate step. She had not sought a throne. She had found a cause. And in the gentle accumulation of small, brave acts, the world had, indelibly, changed. If this story of an arrogant teacher testing a black student in public, not knowing she had a genius IQ and a photographic memory, reached you, remember this. The smallest acts of courage matter, and a single voice, stated with precision and paired with moral bravery, can ripple into a revolution of everyday justice.